The war room was almost quiet enough to hear the pencils shaking. On the table lay the Western Front, a maze of grease pencil lines, colored pins, and arrows that had once promised victory. Now they marked only retreat. Around the map stood a handful of staff officers, uniforms immaculate, faces gray with exhaustion. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the stale smell of cold coffee. At the far end of the table, under the harsh glare of a single lamp, sat Adolf Hitler. He stared at the map, unblinking, as if he could will the lines to move back toward the English Channel. Outside the concrete walls of his headquarters, the Third Reich was crumbling. Inside, no one wanted to break the silence. Finally, an operations officer stepped forward, report folder clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. He cleared his throat once, then again. Main Führer. There is fresh information from the American sector. Hitler's eyes flicked up, sharp and suspicious. The officer laid a sheet on the table, beside the cluster of pins that marked the American Third Army. The arrows there had advanced far beyond where the staff had expected them to be 3 days ago. Now they curved like a sickle behind German positions that were supposed to be holding a defensive line. The Americans under General Patton have broken through again, the officer said, voice barely steady. Our forces attempting to withdraw were overtaken. Current estimates: another 50,000 men taken prisoner. For a moment, nothing moved. The room held its breath. Then Hitler's hand slammed onto the table, rattling coffee cups and sending a few pins skittering across the map. Impossible, he spat. Lies, exaggeration. No German division allows itself to be taken like cattle. They have orders. They are to stand fast. They are to fight to the last man. The officer did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the paper, as if the ink might somehow soften. These figures come from multiple Army Group reports, Main Führer, encirclements, mass surrenders, fuel shortages. Many units report no ammunition. Radio traffic indicates Hitler cut him off with a tirade, his voice rising, accusing entire corps of cowardice and treason. He demanded to know which generals had failed him this time, who had dared to retreat without orders, who had allowed another 50,000 to fall into American hands. On the wall, the map offered its own silent rebuttal. Every inch Patton's spearheads drove eastward meant more men cut off from supply, more formations forced to choose between annihilation and surrender. In Hitler's mind, the war in the West was still a matter of willpower. On the ground, his field armies were bleeding out, division by division, to an enemy that refused to slow down. That widening gap between what he demanded and what his soldiers could still do would define every decision that followed. By late summer 1944, the war in the West had changed in a single violent lurch. For 2 months after D-Day, Allied forces had been bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy, grinding forward field by field, village by village. German units, though outnumbered and outgunned, had used the terrain to stall the invasion. Every mile had been paid for in blood and time. Then came the breakout. In late July, Operation Cobra shattered the German line south of Saint-Lô. Allied bombers pulverized the front, turning defensive positions into smoking craters. When the dust settled, the German formations that had held Normandy together were stunned, splintered, and suddenly unable to plug the gaps opening in their front. Into that breach, the Americans unleashed a weapon they'd been holding in reserve: George S. Patton and the U.S. Third Army. Patton had been sidelined after slapping a hospitalized soldier in Sicily, his future uncertain. But the high command knew one thing: if there was a moment when speed and aggression could turn a breakthrough into a collapse, Patton was the man to do it. In early August, Third Army became operational. The leash came off. Patton's philosophy of war was brutally simple: keep moving. Don't give the enemy time to reorganize. Don't let him form a new line. Don't let him catch his breath. His headquarters pushed armored columns forward in great sweeping arcs, probing for weak spots and then driving through them without hesitation. Where other commanders talked about consolidating gains, Patton talked about hunting down retreating Germans. On the back roads and highways of France, German formations that had once marched into Russia with parade ground precision were now reduced to chaotic columns of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and exhausted infantry. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and hammered from the air whenever they moved by day. Many had lost contact with neighboring units, with command staffs scrambling just to learn where their own troops were. Patton saw opportunity. He ordered his corps commanders to swing wide, to get behind retreating forces and cut the roads they needed to escape. What had been an orderly withdrawal on a map became, on the ground, a series of disaster zones, convoys blocked by destroyed vehicles, crossroads under artillery fire, bridges already in American hands. Surrounded and harassed from every direction, thousands of German soldiers began to surrender rather than be cut down in open fields or slaughtered in columns trapped on the road. Every day, the prisoner counts climbed. Hundreds here, thousands there, then tens of thousands as pockets collapsed. What to the Germans felt like a desperate fighting retreat looked, on Allied situation reports, like a rout. Patton's Third Army wasn't just defeating units. It was scooping them up in great sweeps, turning beaten formations into prisoners on an industrial scale. But while Patton's tanks were racing through the French countryside, the man nominally commanding the German war effort was fighting a very different war, one that existed mostly in his head. Adolf Hitler still believed that wars were won by willpower. The lessons of the Eastern Front, the encirclements, the annihilations, the catastrophes his own, no retreat orders had helped. Cause had not changed his thinking. To him, any withdrawal was weakness. Any flexible defense was cowardice dressed up as strategy. He issued stand-fast orders to divisions already half destroyed, commanded that fortress cities be held to the last round, and demanded local counterattacks from units that barely had fuel to move. When reports from France spoke of collapsing lines and massive surrenders, he didn't see logistical reality. He saw betrayal. In the concrete security of his headquarters, Hitler could move pins on a map and imagine shattered divisions reforming overnight, turning to strike the exposed flanks of the American advance. He conjured up counterstrokes and miracle weapons that would restore the front, if only his commanders showed the necessary fanaticism. He dismissed sober assessments from the field and clung instead to generals, willing to promise that a decisive blow was still possible. On the ground, Patton's staff officers were calculating fuel consumption and bridge capacities. In Hitler's circle, men were calculating how to phrase bad news in a way that wouldn't accost them their careers or their lives. That was the collision slowly building across France. On one side, a commander whose entire method was rooted in motion, adaptation, and exploiting every German weakness as soon as it appeared. On the other, a dictator waging a fantasy war, demanding that units fight on long after their strength, ammunition, and options were gone. When those two worlds met, Patton's relentless advance and Hitler's refusal to accept retreat, the result was inevitable. Vast horizons of abandoned equipment, shattered columns, and more reports of another 10,000 taken, another 20,000 prisoners, until the numbers climbed so high that even in Hitler's sealed-off headquarters, they could no longer be ignored. By August, the German retreat in France was no longer a maneuver. It was a collapse in slow motion. Once Patton's Third Army broke through the bottleneck at Avranches, his armored columns fanned out like blades cutting into soft ground. One thrust rolled west into Brittany, slashing supply lines and port defenses. Others pivoted east and south, racing along country roads and main highways toward the heart of France. Fuel trucks, repair crews, and command jeeps struggled to keep up. The unofficial standing order was simple: keep moving as long as there is gasoline in the tanks. Ahead of them, the German front was coming apart. What had once been a coherent line was now a scattering of disconnected strongpoints anchored on rivers and towns. Divisions that had been bled white in Normandy were ordered to hold temporary positions along the Loire or the Seine to buy time for a new defensive belt to form. In reality, these lines were full of gaps. Units arrived late, under strength, and often without clear orders. Many never arrived at all. On the roads, the chaos was visible for miles. German retreat columns clogged narrow lanes, staff cars, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, tanks running on fumes, and long strings of infantry trudging beside overloaded wagons. Every bridge became a choke point. Every bomb crater or broken-down vehicle could halt an entire column. Overhead, Allied fighter bombers circled like birds of prey, diving on any movement they saw in daylight. Patton's staff read those aerial reports and saw an army ripe for encirclement. Third Army's corps were directed not just to push the enemy back, but to get around him, to seize crossings, road junctions, and high ground before German forces could retreat through them. In practice, this meant that a German unit trying to pull back to a new line might round a bend in the road and find American tanks already astride the route, guns trained on the column. With fuel dumps destroyed and ammunition nearly gone, the choice quickly narrowed to two options: scatter into the fields and die in small groups, or raise white flags and hope to survive the war in a prison camp. Here and there, German local commanders tried to organize breakout attempts. A Kampfrupp would be thrown together from whatever tanks still ran and whatever infantry could still march. They would attack along a narrow axis, hoping to punch a hole for the rest to escape. Sometimes they bought a few hours. More often, they were met by fresh American armor, artillery, and roving fighter bombers that shredded any formation daring to mass in daylight. In one sector after another, these improvised defenses simply disintegrated. River lines that had been marked on German planning maps as final stands turned, in reality, into brief delays followed by bridges captured intact or seized only minutes before demolitions could be completed. Each lost crossing meant another pocket sealed, another group of regiments trapped. The prisoner cages began to fill. At American collection points, barbed wire enclosures sprang up in fields and pastures. German soldiers were marched in by the hundreds, then by the thousands infantry with torn boots and hollow cheeks, panzer crews blackened with oil and smoke, officers clutching briefcases that no longer contained meaningful orders. Guards scrambled to find enough rations and water. Clerks struggled to process identification cards, record unit numbers, and keep up with the tide of men now listed as POW instead of combat effective. On Third Army's situation maps, these captures were numbers written in grease pencil. On German reports, they were something more ominous: blank spaces where divisions used to be. At Army and Corps headquarters on the German side, the tone of messages shifted from cautious optimism to alarm. Staff officers who had once assured their superiors that the front could be stabilized now found themselves relaying a different story. Regiments missing, battalion commanders out of contact, artillery batteries overrun before they could limber up. Requests to withdraw to more defensible terrain grew more urgent and more frequent. Again and again, field commanders signaled the same reality. If they did not pull back now, they would be surrounded. If they stayed another day, they risked losing not hundreds, but tens of thousands of men. But those requests did not end with the men who signed them. They filtered upward, climbing through a labyrinth of headquarters, each level adding its own hesitation and political instinct. By the time they neared the inner circle around Hitler, the language often changed. Necessary adjustment of the line became temporary tactical setback. Encirclement became flexible defense. Surrender was almost unmentionable. Still, numbers could not be disguised forever. Daily tallies of casualties and prisoners had to be compiled. Staff officers bent over typewriters and adding machines, trying to reconcile missing units with rushed radio snippets and panicked phone calls. When Third Army's advance cut off an entire corps' headquarters, the list of unaccounted for formations jumped dramatically. Suddenly, The figures on those reports were no longer in the hundreds or low thousands. They were in the tens of thousands. Preparing to brief that to Hitler was a task no one wanted. In the cramped offices behind the Situation Room, officers quietly argued about how to present the figures. Was it better to understate and then update later, or to deliver the full shock at once and hope his fury would burn out quickly? Some tried to shift the blame to other army groups, to the Luftwaffe's failure to contest Allied air power, to cowardly local commanders who had allegedly retreated without authorization. But whatever phrases they chose, the core reality remained. Every day that Patton's spearheads kept moving, more German units ceased to exist as fighting forces and reappeared only as lines in Allied POW ledgers. On paper, Hitler's orders still demanded that these men fight to the last bullet, that they hold every town as a fortress, that they die where they stood rather than fall back. In the fields and villages of France, the soldiers who received those orders looked at their empty fuel tanks, their dwindling ammunition, the American tanks on the ridgeline, and the fighter bombers streaking above them, and often made a different choice. The widening gap between those two worlds, between the fantasy of no retreat and the reality of mass surrender, would soon be measured not just in lost ground, but in the staggering prisoner counts being slid across Hitler's map table. Each encirclement Patton closed, each road junction he seized, turned that gap into something impossible to ignore. Hitler's fury over another 50,000 prisoners didn't erupt in a vacuum. It came at a moment when Patton's advance threatened to turn defeat into outright disintegration. In mid-August 1944, the German position in France hinged on a single crumbling pivot, the Falaise Pocket. After the Normandy breakout, German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves bent backward into a shrinking salient, hammered from the air and squeezed from three sides. To the north, British and Canadian forces pushed south. To the south, American units including elements of Patton's freshly activated Third Army drove north toward Arlington. On the maps in Allied headquarters, a simple curve of pencil completed the picture. If Patton's spearheads continued their drive and linked up with the British and Canadians, tens of thousands of German troops would be trapped. For the German High Command, the danger was obvious. For Hitler, it was something else, another test of will. Frontline generals begged for permission to pull back before the jaws of the encirclement snapped shut. Reports warned that the only escape routes were already under artillery fire, that columns trying to retreat east were being strafed to pieces on the roads, that fuel and ammunition were almost gone. The language was unusually blunt for German situation reports. If they did not move now, whole armies would be lost. Hitler's response was simple and devastating: no retreat. He issued stand-fast orders that reached down through the chain of command like a death sentence. Divisions ordered to hold their ground were told that any withdrawal not personally authorized by him would be treated as treason. Commanders were reminded of the fate of those who had crossed him before arrest, show trials, firing squads. Military police with the telltale chain dog gorgets were instructed to block roads, turn back stragglers, and, if necessary, shoot any soldier attempting to fall back without orders. Inside the shrinking pocket, officers faced an impossible equation: obey and die, or disobey and be branded traitors. While Hitler demanded sacrifice on paper, Patton's units were writing the outcome in steel and fire. His corps on the southern flank pushed hard toward Arlington, threatening to snap the trap shut. Columns rolled through bomb-scarred villages and along country roads lined with burned-out vehicles. Resistance was fierce in pockets, but disorganized. Some German units fought fanatically. Others had been reduced to small, exhausted groups, simply trying to find a way east before the gap closed. From Patton's perspective, the objective was clear: keep the door as small as possible, for as long as possible. Every hour Third Army held the southern shoulder of the pocket, more German men and machines were caught under the Allied noose. Artillery observers called down fire on any bridge, crossroads, or wooded lane that might conceal retreating columns. Fighter bombers circled like hawks, diving on anything that moved. When the Falaise Argentan pocket finally collapsed, the numbers were staggering. Fields were choked with wrecked vehicles and bodies. Thousands had slipped out through the narrow escape corridor while it still existed. But tens of thousands hadn't. They lay dead in ditches or were herded, dazed and filthy, into Allied prison pens. In the aftermath, Allied reports spoke of more than 50,000 prisoners taken in that sector alone. Those were the sorts of figures that began landing on Hitler's map table. In his headquarters, the narrative was quickly rewritten. The men who surrendered had not been starved of fuel and ammunition, abandoned by air and artillery support, or trapped by an enemy exploiting superior mobility. They had failed in their duty. They had shown insufficient hardness. Entire divisions were denounced as cowards. Generals were stripped of command, some threatened with court-martial or worse. Hitler's rage fixed not on his own orders, but on the supposed weakness of units that had been ground down to the breaking point. As summer turned to early autumn and Patton's army lunged eastward across France, the pattern repeated on a wider scale. After Falaise, Third Army surged toward the Seine. German plans called for establishing a firm line along the river, a last barrier before the interior of France. In reality, many units reached the far bank shattered, with only fragments making it across hastily prepared bridges. Others never arrived. Patton's columns, using every intact crossing they could seize and throwing up pontoon bridges where needed, crossed in force. Once again, they got behind the retreating Germans, cutting roads and rail lines, turning a planned withdrawal into another series of pockets. Each time a German corps tried to reform a coherent front, Patton's staff looked for ways to outflank it, to find the gap, push armor through, and collapse the line from the rear. And each time they succeeded, more men were captured. Prison cages behind Third Army's front expanded. Barbed wire enclosures held infantry from half a dozen different divisions, all jumbled together, some veterans of Russia and Normandy, some fresh replacements who had barely fired a shot. The sheer pace of it strained Patton's own forces. Third Army burned fuel faster than the Allies could deliver it. The famous Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy system of trucks grinding over French roads day and night, struggled to keep his tanks and half-tracks supplied. Staff officers warned of dangerously thin supply lines stretching back to the Normandy beaches. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep worn-out vehicles running. Patton's response was to push as far and as fast as his fuel would allow, and then a little farther. He drove his staff mercilessly, demanding new routes, new angles of attack, new ways to keep the pressure on. When told that fuel shortages might require a pause, he raged that every halted day gave the enemy time to dig in, to regroup, to escape. Better, in his view, to run tanks into the red zone and risk stalling than to give the Germans breathing room. On the other side, Hitler answered reports of mass surrender with more threats. As the figures climbed 10,000 here, 20,000 there, then another 50,000 from the collapsing pockets, his orders grew harsher. Units were forbidden to yield ground without a fight to the last bullet. Field commanders were reminded that any retreat required his personal authorization, which often came too late, if it came at all. When encirclements occurred, as they increasingly did, the blame was laid at the feet of those closest to the fighting. The contradiction was now stark. In the French countryside, German officers looked at their maps and saw units that no longer existed, divisions reduced to remnants, artillery batteries with no shells, tanks with empty fuel tanks, and no spare parts. They watched columns of their own men mud-stained, hungry, eyes fixed on the horizon being marched into captivity by American guards. They knew that if they insisted on standing fast, they weren't buying time for a miracle counterattack. They were sentencing their soldiers to death or imprisonment. In Hitler's headquarters, those same men were abstractions, lines on a map, numbers in a report, tools that had failed him, By the time word reached him that Patton had captured yet another mass of prisoners, the pattern was unmistakable. On one side, a commander exploiting every weakness, driving his formations to the limit to keep the enemy off balance, turning retreat into rout. On the other, a dictator who believed that by threatening to shoot his own officers, he could somehow reverse the laws of logistics, morale, and firepower. The result could be seen in every makeshift POW cage behind Third Army's front. Endless columns of gray-green uniforms, their owners ordered to fight to the last man, but choosing instead to survive, while somewhere far behind them, a furious voice demanded that they should have died where they stood. On paper, Hitler's stand-fast orders sounded like a recipe for iron resistance. In practice, they hollowed out his army in the West. The veteran divisions that had fought from Poland to Russia, and then to Normandy, were not just losing ground. They were vanishing. At Falaise, along the Seine, and in the rolling retreats that followed, entire cadres of seasoned non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and platoon leaders who held units together under fire, disappeared into Allied POW cages. Company and battalion commanders, with years of hard-won experience, joined them. What emerged on the German side to replace them were numbers on the mobilization chart. Rushed replacements, teenagers and older men pulled from training depots and rear area units, handed rifles, and thrown into line. On the situation maps in Berlin, the symbols for divisions were still there. But behind many of those symbols, the reality had changed. A formation that had once fielded 15,000 hardened troops might now be a few thousand exhausted survivors, stiffened with barely trained conscripts. Defensive lines that Hitler imagined as solid walls were on the ground thin screens, a scattering of strong points, a handful of guns and men who had seen what happened to the last generation ordered to hold at all costs. Each time Hitler raged at another 50,000 prisoners, he demanded that the next formation do what the last had failed to do: stand, fight, die if necessary. Yet every such loss made that demand harder to fulfill. With each pocket closed, each mass surrender, the Western Front's ability to absorb Allied blows shrank. The Reich was cannibalizing its most capable soldiers, feeding them into a machine that turned them into statistics on Allied POW rolls, then trying to plug the gaps with whatever human material remained. For the Allies, the picture was more complicated. Patton's haul of prisoners and captured ground translated into momentum. Rail lines seized, bridges held, launch pads for the next advance. But the speed of the collapse also created its own problems. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel shortages intensified. Opportunities for even tighter encirclements were sometimes missed because the Allies simply couldn't be strong everywhere at once. Strategic debates flared behind their own maps: where to allocate gasoline, which thrust to prioritize, how far forward Patton should be allowed to run. Still, the imbalance was unmistakable. One side was burning through its irreplaceable core, even as its leaders screamed for greater sacrifices. The other was straining its logistics, precisely because its offensives were succeeding beyond expectation. In that contrast, the regime that demanded suicidal obedience while it dismantled its own army, and the general whose relentless drive forced those contradictions into the open, you can see the true cost of Hitler's denial written across the Western Front. By the time reports of another 50,000 captured reached Hitler's desk, the war he was fighting no longer resembled the one unfolding in the fields and villages of Western Europe. To Hitler, the army was no longer a finite instrument made up of individual human beings. It was an abstraction, a reservoir of will to be tapped until it ran dry. Surrender was not a rational response to encirclement, empty fuel tanks, and overwhelming firepower. It was treason. His words in those final months reveal a man who had ceased to think in terms of preserving combat power or trading space for time. He thought, instead of punishment, of purges, of executions, of terror, as a substitute for strategy. On the other side of the lines, Patton, vain, abrasive, and often courting controversy, was anchored in a reality Hitler refused to accept. He understood that armored warfare was about tempo, logistics, and shock, not speeches. In a bitter irony, he employed the very principles of FAST, encircling operations that German generals had perfected earlier in the war, and turned them back on the Reich. Where Hitler had once boasted of blitzkrieg, he now watched, helpless, as Allied spearheads used that same style to carve up his remaining armies. The mass surrenders that so enraged him were not merely signs of weakness. They were the inevitable result of a command system that ordered men to die in place while offering them no realistic path to victory. In the end, Hitler's refusal to face reality transformed the Western Front into a machine that devoured his own forces. Patton's refusal to slow down ensured that each fresh report of another 50,000 prisoners was more than a number. It was one more step toward the total collapse of the regime that had demanded they fight to the last.